Power rarely announces itself when it enters a room. More often, it sits quietly behind a name, a document, or a legacy that others are too distracted to recognize. The most expensive mistake a person can make is assuming ownership belongs to the loudest voice in the ballroom. On a cold November evening, Manhattan glittered beneath a veil of silver rain. 53 floors above Park Avenue, the Ashford Heritage Gala unfolded beneath crystal chandeliers that had once illuminated royal receptions and presidential fundraisers. The ballroom glowed with gold light reflected across polished marble floors, champagne towers, white orchids, and black-tie wealth. Hedge fund managers discussed acquisitions beside museum trustees. Luxury hotel owners exchanged greetings with foundation directors. A string quartet played softly beneath murals worth more than entire city blocks. Everything in the room had a price. Everything except legacy. Amara Bennett Whitmore stepped through the ballroom entrance without announcement. Her midnight black gown carried no visible designer logo. A single emerald brooch rested against her left shoulder, secured above the elegant line of the dress. Compared to the diamonds around her, the piece seemed almost modest. The emerald was deep green, surrounded by intricate silver detailing worn smooth by generations of careful hands. Several guests noticed it immediately, not because it glittered more brightly than their jewels, but because it seemed older than the room itself. Amara moved through the crowd with measured calm. She acknowledged greetings from trustees, philanthropists, and attorneys without lingering. Her expression remained composed, her posture effortless. She did not seek attention. Attention found her anyway. Across the ballroom, Marcus Whitmore stood beside Savannah Pierce beneath a cascade of crystal light. The billionaire technology founder looked exactly as financial magazines preferred him to look: tailored tuxedo, practiced confidence, and the easy smile of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. Marcus and Amara were currently navigating a highly publicized, bitter separation. It had been tabloid fodder for months, making Savannah's champagne-colored gown and presence tonight a calculated insult. Cameras followed the new couple whenever they moved. Marcus appeared pleased by that. He always was. Future Labs had become the project Marcus intended to leave behind when the headlines faded. More than a company initiative, it was the legacy he expected to define his name. Savannah noticed Amara before Marcus did. Her gaze settled on the emerald brooch. "Interesting choice," she said lightly. "I thought tonight was a gala, not an antique exhibition." Marcus turned toward his estranged wife. His eyes landed on the brooch. For a brief moment, something unreadable crossed his face before disappearing beneath amusement. Nearby investors chuckled politely. Amara said nothing. A waiter passed carrying crystal glasses filled with vintage Bordeaux. She accepted one and continued observing the room. Near the ballroom's western wall stood a display of historical artifacts belonging to the Ashford Cultural Foundation. Among them sat a glass case containing a faded parchment document protected beneath museum-grade lighting. Brought out of the vault tonight for the first time in half a century to celebrate the gala's anniversary, most guests still walked past it without looking. Amara's eyes paused there for only a second, long enough to notice the familiar emerald crest embossed in the corner of the display plaque, long enough to recognize something no one else seemed to see. Then she looked away. Across the room, Marcus continued entertaining investors and media executives. Savannah leaned closer to him, laughing softly at something he whispered, playing the role of the future Mrs. Whitmore flawlessly. The emerald brooch caught the chandelier light again. This time Marcus noticed. His smile widened. Not warmly, not affectionately. The way men smile when they discover an opportunity to perform superiority in front of an audience. Around them, conversations continued beneath crystal light and orchestral music. Yet several guests had already begun glancing between Marcus and Amara, sensing tension, anticipating entertainment. At the center of it all, the emerald brooch remained motionless, against Amara's shoulder. An object, a symbol, a clue hidden in plain sight. And when Marcus finally lifted his glass and looked directly at it, amusement flickering openly across his face, the first crack in the evening quietly appeared. The Ashford Heritage Gala had been appearing in society columns long before Marcus Whitmore earned his first $1 billion. Families whose names occupied museum wings, university libraries, and private foundations moved through the ballroom with practiced ease, discussing legacy rather than valuation. Yet Marcus carried himself as though the entire evening existed to celebrate his presence. Wealth had taught him many things. Humility was not one of them. He stood beneath a chandelier imported from Vienna nearly a century earlier, surrounded by investors, journalists, and executives eager to remain close to success. Savannah Pierce remained at his side, accepting compliments as though she had always belonged among trustees and cultural patrons. Every few minutes another photographer approached. Marcus never refused a photograph. Across the ballroom, Amara Bennett Whitmore spoke quietly with an elderly museum director. The emerald brooch rested against her shoulder, catching occasional reflections from the crystal ceiling. Unlike the diamonds surrounding it, the piece carried no obvious brand, no visible prestige, no marketing value. To Marcus, that made it invisible. Years earlier, when they were newly married, Amara had worn the same brooch to a private dinner in Boston. Marcus remembered asking whether she wanted him to buy her something newer, something larger, something worthy of a billionaire's wife. Amara had simply smiled and declined. At the time, he assumed sentimentality explained her attachment. He never asked again. That pattern had quietly repeated throughout their marriage. Marcus purchased penthouses, yachts, and luxury estates. Amara preserved documents, family records, and heirlooms. Marcus collected assets. Amara protected history. He viewed one as valuable and the other as decorative. Savannah noticed the brooch again as a group of guests gathered around them. "She's still wearing it," she said with a soft laugh. "I honestly thought it was part of a vintage costume." Several people smiled politely. Marcus took a sip of champagne. "You might be giving it too much credit." More laughter followed. Not cruel enough to attract criticism, just enough to establish a hierarchy. Amara heard none of it. Or perhaps she heard all of it and chose silence. That possibility irritated Marcus more than he cared to admit. Near the ballroom's eastern wall, a display honoring the Ashford Foundation's original benefactors attracted a small crowd. Beneath museum glass rested historical ledgers, trust agreements, and founding documents dating back generations. Most guests ignored them. One young attorney studying the display frowned briefly before leaning closer to a parchment protected inside a climate-controlled case. The document carried an emerald-colored seal, remarkably similar to the stone on Amara's brooch. He looked toward her across the ballroom, then toward the display, then back again. Moments later, a foundation employee quietly approached and guided him elsewhere. The interruption lasted only seconds. Few people noticed. Amara did. Her gaze lingered on the display before returning to her conversation. For the first time in years, someone had noticed the seal. Marcus remained unaware. He was too busy explaining a recent acquisition to a group of venture capital executives. Savannah listened attentively, resting her hand lightly on his arm. The gesture looked intimate enough to draw attention, but subtle enough to avoid criticism. Exactly the balance she preferred. As the evening continued, the distance between Marcus and Amara seemed larger than the ballroom itself. One built influence through visibility. The other carried something older, something hidden beneath silver filigree and emerald stone. Then Savannah crossed the room toward Amara with a bright smile and a question that sounded innocent enough to everyone except the woman wearing the brooch. "Tell me," she said lightly, her voice carrying farther than necessary. "Has anyone ever actually told you what that thing is worth?" Around them, several conversations began to fade, and for the first time that evening, Amara slowly turned toward her. For a moment, the question seemed harmless. The kind of comment wealthy people made when they wanted curiosity to sound like sophistication. Savannah stood beneath the chandelier light with a champagne glass balanced delicately between her fingers, smiling as though she had offered a compliment rather than a challenge. Around them, conversation slowed. Not enough to appear obvious, just enough for people to listen. Amara regarded her quietly. The emerald brooch rested against the black silk of her gown, unchanged beneath the attention suddenly directed toward it. "Its value depends on what you're measuring," she replied. Savannah laughed softly. "That's usually what people say when they don't know the number." A few nearby guests smiled. Marcus joined them, sliding effortlessly into the center of the gathering. He looked amused, comfortable, confident that the evening remained entirely under his control. "Savannah has a point," he said. "Most heirlooms become stories people tell because the actual asset isn't worth much anymore. The comment drew another round of polite laughter. Amara did not react. Marcus noticed. He always noticed when she refused to play the role others expected. During their marriage, silence had often frustrated him more than disagreement. He knew how to defeat arguments. He never quite knew how to defeat patience. Savannah studied the brooch more closely. "So what exactly is it?" she asked. "A family keepsake?" Amara's fingers touched the emerald briefly. "Something like that." The answer seemed to disappoint everyone except Amara herself. The ballroom carried on around them. Waiters moved between tables carrying crystal flutes and silver trays. Foundation directors discussed charitable endowments near the ballroom terrace. Across the room, the Ashford Foundation display remained illuminated beneath museum lighting. The emerald seal on the historical charter glowed faintly behind protective glass. Unnoticed by nearly everyone, Marcus followed Amara's gaze toward the exhibit. "You've been looking at that display all evening. It's interesting. Historical paperwork." Marcus smiled. "That sounds exactly like your idea of entertainment." More laughter. Savannah leaned closer. "Honestly, I don't understand the obsession with old family objects. Wealth should move forward." Amara looked at her. "Sometimes it does. And sometimes," Savannah asked, "sometimes it remembers who built it." The response landed oddly. Not because it sounded threatening, because it sounded factual. Several guests exchanged brief glances. Marcus dismissed it immediately. "Trust me," he said. "If that brooch were actually important, someone in this room would have mentioned it years ago." The statement lingered longer than he intended. Nearby, an elderly trustee, standing beside the foundation display, glanced toward them. His eyes settled on the emerald stone. For a brief moment, recognition crossed his face. Then he lowered his gaze and continued walking. Amara noticed. Marcus did not. A foundation archivist appeared near the exhibit carrying a slim leather portfolio. She unlocked the display case containing the founding charter and quietly inspected the document inside. The movement attracted little attention, yet Amara watched the process with unusual focus. The archivist carefully verified a signature page before closing the case again. The archive was paying attention now. Marcus followed her gaze once more. "You know something about that document?" Amara looked at him calmly. "Only what my family taught me." Savannah smiled. "That sounds mysterious." "Not really." Amara's expression remained composed. "It's just history." Then she turned away, ending the conversation before anyone could ask another question. Marcus watched her cross the ballroom toward the terrace doors. The emerald brooch caught the light one final time, and for reasons he could not explain, the sight irritated him enough that an idea began forming behind his smile. If Amara insisted on treating the brooch like something important, perhaps tonight was the perfect opportunity to prove otherwise. Amara's gaze settled on Savannah with the same composure she might have given a board member asking about quarterly reports. Around them, the ballroom's golden atmosphere remained elegant on the surface, but attention had already shifted. Conversations continued in fragments. Crystal glasses moved. The string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Yet dozens of guests were now listening without appearing to listen. Savannah smiled patiently, waiting for an answer. Marcus watched with growing amusement. "Well," Savannah asked, "how much is it worth?" Amara glanced down at the emerald brooch resting against her shoulder. "More than most people realize." The answer drew a few quiet smiles. Savannah laughed. "That's not a number." Marcus lifted his glass. "To be fair, neither is sentimental value." Several investors nearby chuckled. One of the journalists from Manhattan Society lowered his phone and looked over. He sensed a story forming. Amara simply turned toward the ballroom display once more. "Some things aren't measured in dollars." Marcus shook his head. "Everything is measured in dollars eventually." Savannah smiled brightly. "That's why auctions exist." More laughter followed. The sound carried farther this time. Not cruel enough to cause discomfort, just sharp enough to make a target feel isolated. Marcus enjoyed that balance. He had spent years mastering it. The billionaire stepped closer, placing himself where nearby guests could hear him clearly. "Let's settle it then." His voice rose slightly above the surrounding conversations. "What exactly makes that brooch so special?" Heads turned. The circle around them widened. Amara remained calm. "It's a family heirloom." "Every family has heirlooms," Marcus replied. "Most don't treat them like state secrets." Savannah touched the stem of her champagne glass. Maybe it's one of those stories that gets better every generation. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Across the room, a foundation archivist froze briefly before continuing her work near the display cases. The elderly trustee who had noticed the emerald earlier stopped speaking mid-conversation. Neither interruption was obvious enough to attract attention. Except to Amara. She noticed both. Marcus did not. His audience had become too enjoyable. "Come on," he continued. "Tell everyone." He gestured toward the brooch. "What makes this little antique so important?" The word antique hung in the air. Savannah smiled. Several cameras quietly turned in their direction. Amara looked at Marcus. Not angrily, not defensively, simply looking. That seemed to frustrate him further. "You know," Marcus said, now fully performing for the room, "I've spent 15 years hearing about this thing." More laughter. "And somehow nobody has ever explained why a piece of old silver deserves so much attention." The journalist opened their notes app. Nearby, a venture capitalist smirked into his drink. Savannah leaned closer to Marcus, enjoying every second. "Maybe it's priceless because nobody wants to buy it." This time the laughter came louder. Marcus laughed too. A clean, confident laugh. The kind that invited everyone else to join. And they did. For a few seconds, the ballroom belonged entirely to him. Amara stood alone at the center of the attention. The emerald brooch remained motionless beneath the chandelier light. Then Marcus delivered the line that finally pushed the evening beyond casual mockery. He pointed toward the historical exhibit across the ballroom. "Maybe we should put it in one of those display cases. Right next to the paperwork nobody reads anymore." The crowd laughed. Several people openly this time. Savannah's laughter rose above all of them. Amara's eyes moved toward the illuminated charter display. For the first time that evening, something changed behind her calm expression. Not hurt. Recognition. As though Marcus had unknowingly stepped on a ground he did not understand. Near the ballroom entrance, a black luxury sedan had just arrived beneath the Ashford building's private canopy. Inside sat Eleanor Ashford. And upstairs, in the ballroom where Marcus Whitmore believed he was winning, the first reporter pressed record. The laughter lingered long after Marcus finished speaking. Not because the joke was particularly clever, but because powerful people often laughed when a billionaire gave them permission to. Crystal glasses lifted. Investors smiled. A few guests repeated the remark about the display case as though it deserved preservation itself. Marcus accepted their reactions with relaxed confidence. He had spent years cultivating rooms exactly like this. Rooms where approval followed him naturally. Rooms where success became authority. Savannah stood beside him, glowing beneath the ballroom lights. She looked delighted. Several photographers approached and requested a few images. Marcus wrapped an arm lightly around her waist, while flashes illuminated the marble floor and gold-trimmed columns. The images would appear online before midnight. He knew that. He enjoyed that. Across the ballroom, Amara had become almost invisible. Not because she lacked presence, because attention had been redirected elsewhere. The emerald brooch remained pinned to her shoulder. The journalist who had briefly watched her now focused on Marcus and Savannah. A reporter from Manhattan Society approached Marcus for a short interview. "Remarkable turnout tonight," she said. "The Ashford Gala keeps growing every year." Marcus smiled easily. Good institutions attract good support. Savannah nodded as though she had personally contributed to the foundation's legacy. Nearby guests laughed warmly. Cameras flashed again. For Marcus, the evening had returned to its proper shape. He was once again the center of gravity. Near the terrace, Amara stood alone for several minutes overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Rain shimmered against the glass. Beyond the river, towers glowed beneath the November darkness. She held a crystal flute untouched in one hand. Her expression remained unreadable. Not once did she attempt to defend herself. Not once did she explain the significance of the brooch. Not once did she correct Marcus. That silence only reinforced his confidence. If she had possessed an answer, surely she would have used it by now. Meanwhile, Savannah became increasingly comfortable. She moved among trustees, donors, and executives with growing ease. Several guests assumed she belonged at Marcus's side permanently. One hedge fund manager even referred to her as the future Mrs. Whitmore. Savannah's smile widened. Marcus did not correct him. Across the ballroom, a pair of foundation board members exchanged quiet looks. One glanced toward Amara. The other looked away. Neither spoke. The moment passed unnoticed. At the Ashford Foundation exhibit, the archivist had returned carrying another leather portfolio. She unlocked the historical display for the second time that evening. A document was carefully removed and inspected beneath white gloves before being placed inside a protective folder. The process seemed routine, yet the archivist checked the emerald seal twice before closing the case. Amara noticed. Marcus remained occupied with interviews. The journalist from Manhattan Society eventually asked about the evening's theme. Legacy, she said. What does legacy mean to you? Marcus laughed softly. Building something too large to be forgotten. The answer earned approving nods. Savannah looked impressed. Several investors applauded lightly. It felt like victory, complete and unquestioned. Then a commotion near the ballroom entrance interrupted the atmosphere. Nothing dramatic. No raised voices. Simply movement. Foundation staff began repositioning themselves. Security personnel adjusted their posture. Trustees straightened jackets and conversations ended mid-sentence. One by one, heads turned toward the entrance doors. Marcus noticed and smiled. He assumed another donor had arrived. Another opportunity for networking. Another audience. He took a sip of champagne and glanced toward Savannah. Looks like the guest of honor finally decided to appear. The ballroom doors opened. Eleanor Ashford entered beneath the crystal light. And for the first time all evening, several people stopped paying attention to Marcus Whitmore. Eleanor Ashford did not enter rooms. Rooms adjusted themselves around her. The 72-year-old chairwoman of the National Cultural Heritage Council moved through the ballroom in black silk and pearls, carrying the quiet authority of a woman whose name could open museum archives, university halls, and private foundation doors without a single raised word. Conversations lowered as she crossed the marble floor. Trustees straightened. Donors stepped aside. Even the photographers seemed to understand that flashbulbs should wait for permission. Marcus noticed the shift and welcomed it. This was the kind of power he respected because it was visible. Savannah touched his arm lightly, arranging her smile as Eleanor approached the presentation platform near the grand staircase. The string quartet faded. Crystal glasses settled onto silver trays. The ballroom prepared for formal remarks. Eleanor began with legacy, stewardship, preservation, and the responsibility of families whose names survived longer than their fortunes. Then, midway through a sentence, her voice stopped. Not dramatically, not with shock, simply stopped. Her gaze had moved past Marcus, past Savannah, past the circle of trustees, and settled on Amara Bennett Whitmore's left shoulder. More specifically, on the emerald brooch. The ballroom followed her eyes. Amara remained still. Eleanor stepped away from the podium and crossed the floor toward her. Each step tightened the silence. Marcus frowned slightly. Savannah's smile weakened. Eleanor stopped in front of Amara and studied the brooch with an expression that was not certainty yet, but recognition struggling against disbelief. "May I see it?" she asked. Amara removed the brooch with calm precision and placed it in Eleanor's hand. Eleanor turned it beneath the chandelier light. On the reverse side, hidden beneath worn silver filigree, was a small engraved crest. Her expression changed. "I know that crest." She looked toward the Foundation archivist. "Bring the Bennett reference file." The archivist froze for half a second, then moved quickly toward the archival case. A trustee nearby looked suddenly uncomfortable. Marcus noticed that, for the first time all evening, the room was reacting to something he did not understand. Eleanor compared the brooch to the emerald seal displayed on the old charter behind museum glass. "This may be older than the exhibit record," she said. Then she turned to Amara. "Where did your family get this?" Amara's answer came without hesitation. "My grandmother." Eleanor looked at her for a long, searching moment. "Her name?" "Celeste Bennett." One elderly trustee lowered his eyes immediately. Another stopped breathing for a beat too long. Eleanor did not reveal the truth yet. She simply closed her fingers around the brooch with careful respect and said, "Then we need counsel in the room before anyone says another word." The gala did not stop, but it ceased being a gala. Waiters still moved between tables. The chandeliers still burned gold above the marble floor. Manhattan still glittered beyond the rain-streaked windows. Yet every important person in the ballroom now understood that the evening had shifted into institutional territory. Fortunately, the Foundation's legal team was already on site for governance matters related to the gala. Within minutes, The foundation's general counsel arrived from a private office 2 floors below, a silver-haired attorney named Richard Vale, carrying a black leather file embossed with the Ashford Foundation seal. He did not look at Marcus first. He looked at Eleanor, then at Amara, then at the emerald brooch resting on the presentation table. "You asked for the Bennett reference file?" he said. Eleanor nodded. The archivist returned with a sealed archival folder and a climate-controlled document sleeve. Richard opened both carefully, not like a man revealing gossip, but like a lawyer preparing evidence. The first page was a historical reference sheet. The second was a preservation record. The third carried a sketch of a crest identical to the engraving beneath Amara's brooch. A murmur moved through the trustees. Marcus stepped forward. "Can someone explain why an old pin requires legal counsel?" Richard looked at him politely. "Because, Mr. Whitmore, if this identification is correct, it is not merely an old pin." Savannah's expression tightened. "Then what is it?" Richard did not answer her. He turned the next page. Beneath archival protection rested a copy of the original Ashford Bennett Cultural Charter, dated more than a century earlier. The emerald seal appeared at the bottom beside 2 family names, Ashford and Bennett. Eleanor's face remained controlled, but her eyes had sharpened. "We believe the Bennett succession marker was lost," she said. Richard nodded. "That is what the archive notes indicate." Amara said nothing. Marcus looked from the document to his estranged wife. He had heard the Bennett name for years, usually in connection with old family stories Amara never forced him to respect. He had never asked enough questions to learn which stories were legal history. Richard turned another page. "The original capital endowment came from both families," he said. "Ashford provided the public institutional name. Bennett provided the cultural trust assets, several property grants, and the initial preservation fund." The room quieted further. Marcus felt the first true pressure beneath his ribs. "That's history," he said, "not current control." Richard looked at him. "That is what we are verifying." The sentence was calm enough to be dangerous. The attorney then opened a modern certification file attached to the archival record. The Bennett provisions were not dissolved. They were placed into dormant governance status after the last verified successor declined public recognition. Eleanor looked toward Amara. "Celeste Bennett." Amara's face remained composed. Richard continued. "If Mrs. Bennett Whitmore is the direct successor, then the matter is not symbolic." Marcus heard the married name, the maiden name, the legal weight between them. Savannah took a small step backward. Eleanor looked at Richard. "Can the succession record be confirmed tonight?" Richard answered carefully. "Preliminarily, yes. Publicly, only with her acknowledgement." Every eye turned toward Amara. She looked at the brooch, then at the charter, then at the man who had laughed at both. "Then verify it." The verification took 12 minutes. In a ballroom built for applause, 12 minutes of legal silence felt almost violent. Richard Vale worked with the archivist at the presentation table while trustees formed a tight semicircle around the documents. The gala guests pretended not to crowd closer. Journalists pretended not to record every movement. Marcus pretended not to care. He failed at it. Savannah stood beside him with her arms folded, her champagne glass untouched. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "People are acting like she walked in with the crown jewels." Marcus did not answer. His eyes remained on the documents. Richard compared the brooch engraving against the original charter seal, the Bennett reference file, and a notarized succession memorandum from the Foundation archive. Then he opened a final modern document, one Marcus had never seen because it had never appeared in donor brochures or press releases. "This is the dormant governance appendix," Richard said. Several trustees stiffened. Eleanor's expression confirmed she knew exactly what it was. Richard continued. "The appendix confirms that public authority remains with the Ashford Board unless a direct Bennett successor presents the family marker and accepts recognition under Article 7. Marcus frowned. "Dormant authority?" "Yes." "Meaning ceremonial?" Richard looked at him. "No. Meaning inactive until recognized." The distinction landed hard. Eleanor turned toward the gathered room, her voice calm, but carrying clearly. "Many people know the Ashford Foundation as an Ashford institution. That is the public history. It is not the complete legal history." The ballroom went still. The foundation began as an Ashford Bennett structure. The Ashfords gave it public stewardship. The Bennetts gave it the trust assets that allowed it to survive. A trustee lowered his head. Another stepped slightly toward Amara, not as a guest, but as someone acknowledging authority. Marcus saw it. So did Savannah. Richard placed the charter beside the brooch. The crest matches. The reference file matches. The succession line matches Celeste Bennett. He turned to Amara. Mrs. Bennett Whitmore, for the record, are you the granddaughter of Celeste Bennett? Yes. Do you acknowledge possession of the Bennett family marker? Yes. Do you accept preliminary recognition pending formal board certification? The room held its breath. Amara did not look triumphant. She looked prepared. Yes. Richard nodded once and signed the preliminary council certification. Eleanor then addressed the ballroom. Then the Bennett family was never simply a donor family. She paused long enough for the sentence to become irreversible. They were a founding family. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus looked at Amara as if seeing a locked room inside his own marriage for the first time. Savannah's smile had vanished completely. Across the presentation table, the emerald brooch no longer looked like jewelry. It looked like a key. The word founding did not echo loudly. It did not need to. It settled into the ballroom with the weight of old money, older law, and a history that had waited patiently for arrogance to expose itself. Marcus stared at the documents as if concentration alone could rearrange them. The charter remained where Richard Vale had placed it, beside the emerald brooch and the preliminary council certification. Around the presentation table, trustees whispered in low voices. Journalists typed without looking up. Donors who had laughed earlier now stood with the rigid posture of people trying to remember exactly how loudly they had laughed. Eleanor opened the dormant governance appendix again. There is one more matter, she said. Marcus turned toward her. He already disliked the phrase. Richard removed a modern trust summary from the black leather file. The Bennett Cultural Legacy Trust remains active, he said. Its public authority has been dormant, but its assets have continued funding several foundation programs through restricted channels. Savannah blinked. Restricted channels? Richard's tone stayed neutral. Endowments, preservation grants, scholarship funds, property maintenance, and affiliated institutional sponsorships. The words changed the room. This was no longer about family history. This was money, infrastructure, influence. Marcus understood that language. Eleanor looked toward Amara. Your grandmother declined public recognition but did not dissolve the succession rights. Richard nodded. Correct. Her instruction was that the next successor could accept recognition if the marker was ever presented voluntarily. Amara's voice remained calm. She believed recognition should never be pursued, only accepted when circumstances demanded it. Marcus's mouth tightened. He remembered Amara wearing the brooch at dinners, galas, private receptions, even board-related charity events. He remembered dismissing it every time. He had seen the key for years and never recognized the door. Richard turned the trust summary toward the trustees. The current successor, upon acknowledgement, receives preliminary, standing as successor trustee nominee until formal certification is completed. Marcus seized on the word. Nominee. So she doesn't control anything yet. Richard looked at him with professional patience. She has standing to initiate review, preserve trust interests, and request emergency governance assessment. Final certification requires board minutes and trustee ratification. The distinction did not save Marcus. It merely made the danger more realistic. Eleanor spoke next. And because the trust funds active programs, any conduct affecting the trust's reputation or institutional integrity may be reviewed immediately. Savannah's face changed. Because of a joke? She asked. Richard looked at her calmly. Not because of a joke. He turned another page. Because public conduct becomes relevant when it affects trust interests. The room grew quieter. For the first time that evening, several guests seemed to understand that the issue was no longer social. It was institutional. Richard turned another page. The Whitmore Future Labs initiative is listed as a trust-supported affiliated program. You signed the Future Labs affiliation package yourself. Marcus shrugged. I signed hundreds of documents. Richard let the implication settle before continuing. The initiative is built entirely on land leased from the Ashford Bennett Trust. Marcus went still. He had announced that partnership 18 months ago beside foundation banners, education leaders, and national press. He had never read the governance appendix. His chief philanthropy officer had handled the paperwork. His legal team had reviewed the governance appendices years ago. Marcus never had. He signed where counsel indicated and moved on to the press conference. Legal governance structures had always bored him. Amara looked at him quietly, not accusing, remembering. Richard placed the document on the table. The initiative is subject to public conduct and institutional alignment clauses. Eleanor's eyes moved toward Marcus. Those clauses now matter. Around the room, the guests who had once surrounded him began recalculating the evening. Savannah lowered her glass onto a passing tray with a faint tremor. The emerald brooch remained between the charter and the trust summary, silent and devastating. Recognition did not give Amara a throne. It gave her a lever. In rooms like this, that was far more dangerous. Richard Vale placed a single-page acknowledgement before her, its language narrow, precise, and carefully limited. Preliminary successor recognition. Preservation of trust interests. Authority to request emergency governance review. It was not revenge. It was procedure. That made Marcus more uneasy than anger would have. Anger could be negotiated. Procedure had rules. Eleanor stood beside the table while trustees reviewed the document. This does not finalize certification, Richard explained for the room, though every word seemed aimed at Marcus. It confirms that the Bennett successor has appeared, presented the family marker, acknowledged the succession line, and requested preservation review under Article 7. Marcus crossed his arms. So nothing has actually happened. Richard looked up. On the contrary, the Foundation is now obligated to preserve trust interests until the board completes certification. Marcus's expression hardened. I've donated $50 million to this foundation over the last 5 years, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. You don't want to do this. Eleanor looked at him with something bordering on pity. Mr. Whitmore, your generous donations cover the landscaping for our western properties. The Bennett Trust endowed the ground your headquarters stands on. Marcus flinched. I want outside counsel present. Richard met his gaze without blinking. You are free to retain counsel, Mr. Whitmore. The preservation process will proceed regardless. The sentence removed several degrees of warmth from the ballroom. Amara read the acknowledgement calmly. The emerald brooch rested beside her hand. Marcus watched her eyes move across the page and realized, with sudden irritation, that she understood the language better than he did. Of course she did. Trust law had been her discipline long before he decided she was merely elegant. Savannah leaned close to him. You should stop this before it becomes embarrassing. She whispered. Marcus almost laughed at the irony, but no sound came. Amara signed with her full legal name, Amara Bennett Whitmore. The attorney countersigned. Eleanor signed as witness. The trustee chairman added his initials beside the preservation clause. Nothing dramatic occurred. No thunder. No gasps. Over the next several minutes, Foundation staff began moving. Council sent the certification to the board secretary. The archivist sealed copies into the governance file. A trustee stepped aside to call the compliance committee. Another began drafting emergency minutes. The machinery had awakened. Marcus recognized institutional movement when he saw it. He had used it many times against competitors. He simply had never imagined it turning away from him. Richard opened a second folder marked Restricted Governance Review. Savannah saw the label and lost another layer of confidence. Restricted? She said softly. No one responded. Richard looked at Amara. There are 3 preservation actions available tonight. First, confirm the board's certification meeting. Second, place trust-supported affiliations under review. Third, issue a temporary communication hold preventing public use of the Bennett Ashford name until review concludes. Marcus understood the third one immediately. His Future Labs initiative relied on the Foundation's name to secure major expansion agreements and public sector partnerships. A communication hold would not just destroy him socially. It would freeze the company's expansion at the worst possible moment. Eleanor waited. The trustees waited. Amara looked once toward Marcus, not with hatred, but with the calm of a woman observing a clause finally reaching the person who ignored it. Proceed with preservation review, she said. Richard nodded. He didn't invent the penalty on the spot. He simply engaged the automated Article 7 preservation protocol. The order moved quietly from table to council to committee. Across the ballroom, phones began vibrating one by one. This time Marcus knew exactly why. The system did not punish Marcus immediately. It did something worse. It began asking formal questions. Within minutes, the Foundation's compliance committee received the preservation notice. The board's secretary scheduled an emergency certification meeting for the following morning. Council issued a limited communication hold on all trust-supported affiliations using the Bennett Ashford name. None of it sounded dramatic enough for gossip. All of it was dangerous enough for institutions. Marcus stood beside the presentation table as messages moved through the ballroom faster than conversation. A museum director checked her phone and stepped away. A university liaison read the notice twice, then called her general counsel. A philanthropic advisor who had laughed at Marcus's joke earlier lowered his glass and stopped smiling entirely. Savannah tried to regain composure by approaching a cluster of donors near the orchid arrangements. They received her politely, then dispersed within seconds. Her social access, so effortless an hour ago, had become inconvenient. Marcus saw it and looked away. Richard Vail reviewed the first response from Foundation Council. Whitmore Future Labs has been placed under preliminary affiliation review, he said quietly to the trustee chairman. Marcus heard enough. Review for what? Richard answered without emotion. Institutional alignment, public conduct implications, and use of restricted foundation identity. Because I laughed at a brooch? Richard answered before Eleanor could speak. The review concerns public conduct involving trust-related property and affiliated programs. The issue is not the brooch itself. The issue is conduct involving trust interests. The lawyer's tone remained neutral, which somehow made the answer worse. The precision of the sentence left no room for outrage. Marcus said nothing. Savannah's face tightened. She understood, perhaps before Marcus did, that the story was no longer romantic scandal. It was institutional disrespect. A journalist nearby had already framed it that way in her notes. Public ridicule. Hidden founder. Billionaire beneficiary. Governance review. The headline wrote itself. Amara remained near the table, speaking softly with Richard about certification timing. She did not look at Marcus. That absence of attention unsettled him more than confrontation would have. He was accustomed to being resisted. He was not accustomed to being processed. Another message arrived. The board secretary confirmed that the emergency meeting would include outside counsel, trust representatives, and the foundation's reputation committee. A second message confirmed that all Future Labs promotional materials using the Bennett Ashford name were to be paused pending review. Marcus's jaw hardened. That was not collapse yet, but it was the first locked door. Investors noticed. They always noticed locked doors. One of his senior partners approached carefully. Marcus, we may need to brief communications before this spreads. It won't spread. The partner looked toward the journalist recording near the display table. It already has. Savannah touched Marcus's sleeve. Maybe we should leave. For the first time that night, leaving sounded less like control and more like retreat. Across the ballroom, Eleanor spoke with the trustee chairman, then turned toward Amara. The board will need your presence tomorrow. Amara nodded. I'll be there. Marcus heard the sentence. Tomorrow. The consequences would not finish tonight. They would continue without cameras, inside conference rooms, through minutes, signatures, and council review. That was when he realized the evening had not ended with his embarrassment. It had opened a file. By the time the gala resumed its formal program, Marcus had already lost the room. Not publicly, not completely, but unmistakably. The collapse moved in stages, each one polite enough to avoid spectacle and serious enough to be remembered. First came distance. Donors who had sought him out earlier now offered brief nods and moved toward Eleanor. Trustees who once welcomed his visibility now spoke through counsel. Journalists no longer asked about his philanthropy. They asked about the Bennett Trust, the dormant governance appendix, and whether Whitmore Future Labs had benefited from a foundation structure Marcus failed to understand. Then came restraint. The Foundation's communication office issued a neutral internal note confirming that certain trust-supported affiliations were under preliminary review. No accusations. No emotional language. Just enough caution to make every partner examine its exposure. Marcus read the message on his phone beneath the chandelier light. His name was not even in the first paragraph. Somehow that made it worse. Systems did not need to insult him. They only needed to classify him as a risk. Savannah stood beside a marble column, pretending to check her phone while watching photographers move toward Amara. Earlier, cameras had loved her champagne dress and borrowed confidence. Now they wanted the emerald brooch, the charter, the woman who had stood silent while everyone else misunderstood the room. Savannah tried to catch the eye of one society editor she knew from charity lunches. The woman smiled politely. "I'm afraid this isn't the right evening." Then she turned away and rejoined another group. That was when Savannah finally understood the difference between attention and protection. She had received one. Amara had inherited the other. Marcus's senior partner returned with a tightened expression. "Our communications team wants a statement before morning." For the first time that evening, he sounded less like an ally and more like a risk manager. Marcus stared at him. "About what?" "About whether you were aware of the trust connection when Future Labs accepted Foundation affiliation." Marcus looked toward Amara. She was speaking with Eleanor near the presentation table, her posture calm, the emerald brooch once again fastened to her gown. He remembered signing the Future Labs sponsorship package 18 months earlier. He remembered dismissing the appendix as standard charitable language. He remembered telling Amara that legal details were not the same thing as strategy. The memory landed with surgical precision. A third message arrived from his chief philanthropy officer. "Marcus, did you know Bennett was part of the governance structure?" He did not reply. Eleanor returned to the podium before the evening ended. The ballroom became still again, but this time the silence belonged to her, not to Marcus. "Institutions survive," she said, "because they remember what ambition often forgets. They remember who built them. They remember who preserved them. And when necessary, they remember who must be protected from those who mistake access for ownership." No name was mentioned. None was needed. Marcus stood among people who now understood enough to avoid standing too close. Savannah moved half a step away from him without seeming to realize it. Across the ballroom, Amara listened without expression. She had not destroyed him. She had not asked anyone to destroy him. She had only opened the correct file, accepted the correct authority, and allowed the correct system to begin asking questions. That was the true collapse. Not ruin in one night. Something colder. A future full of rooms where Marcus Whitmore would no longer be assumed safe. The rain had stopped over Manhattan. Beyond the ballroom windows, the city shimmered beneath a canopy of lights stretching toward the horizon. Inside the Ashford Heritage Gala, however, no one was looking at the skyline anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the woman standing beside the presentation table. Not because she had demanded attention, because the architecture of power hidden beneath generations of institutions had finally become visible. The emerald brooch rested beside the original charter beneath the chandelier light. For hours it had been treated as an antique, a curiosity, a family keepsake. Now everyone understood what it truly was. Not jewelry, not decoration, a symbol of succession, a marker of authority carried quietly across 6 generations. The room that had laughed at it now regarded it with silence. Eleanor Ashford stepped toward the presentation table one final time. The trustees gathered behind her. Attorneys stood nearby. Journalists waited with phones raised. The evening had evolved into something no one would forget. Eleanor lifted the original charter carefully. "For decades," she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "the public story focused on visible names. But institutions are not sustained by visibility. They are sustained by stewardship." She placed the charter beside the brooch. The Bennett family provided that stewardship. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The documents had already spoken. The governance records had already spoken. The trust itself had already spoken. Marcus stood near the edge of the gathering, no longer surrounded by investors, no longer surrounded by admirers, no longer the gravitational center of the room. The collapse had not taken his wealth. It had taken something he valued more. Assumption. For years he had assumed influence belonged to the person receiving attention. Tonight he had learned the difference between attention and authority. Savannah remained several steps behind him. Earlier, she had moved through the ballroom like someone entering a future she believed was already hers. Now she stood alone. Conversations no longer opened when she approached. Donors who had welcomed her earlier now offered polite smiles before turning away. The social current that had carried her through the evening had vanished without warning. Amara looked neither triumphant nor vindictive. She had never raised her voice, never demanded apologies, never sought revenge. She had simply allowed the truth to emerge. The system had done the rest. Eleanor turned toward her. For a brief moment, the chairwoman's expression softened. "Your grandmother would have been proud." Amara's gaze settled briefly on the brooch. She taught me that ownership and recognition are not the same thing. Eleanor smiled. A lesson many people spend their lives learning. The trustees exchanged measured looks. Several donors seemed suddenly unsure how they should address her. Then something unexpected happened. Eleanor Ashford extended her hand first. Welcome back to the governance legacy of this institution. For several seconds, the ballroom remained silent. Then trustees approached to introduce themselves properly. Foundation directors followed. Several donors stepped forward to introduce themselves properly for the first time that evening. Not because protocol required it, because acknowledgement did. Marcus watched in silence. Hours earlier, he had laughed at the emerald brooch, laughed at forgotten paperwork, laughed at history. Now the charter, the trust, the institutions, and the people who governed them had answered without anger, without argument, without raising their voices. The ballroom remained silent. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. The emerald crest glowed beneath the lights. And standing at the center of the room was the woman everyone had underestimated. Marcus had believed he owned the room because everyone looked at him. But ownership had never belonged to the man commanding attention. It had belonged to the woman carrying the key to the system behind it. And as the evening finally came to an end, no one in the ballroom remembered the joke anymore. Only who had truly owned the room.